Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, so today we're going to be diving into a topic that is, I think, pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
It's the Book of Abraham, and specifically how the Mormon Church has responded to criticisms about its authenticity.
Right.
And we've got a whole stack of sources here.
Yeah.
Historical accounts, scholarly articles, and even some pretty pointed quotes.
Interesting.
That, explore how the church has dealt with these challenges over the years.
Yeah, and what's particularly compelling about this is that the Book of Abraham is really a key text for millions of Mormons.
Absolutely.
And its claims are directly tied to ancient Egypt.
Exactly. It's not like some obscure text,
Right.
tucked away in a corner somewhere.
Right.
This is core scripture.
Yeah.
And it claims to be translated from actual Egyptian papyri that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, obtained in the 1830s.
And that's where the story gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because when Egyptologists, the experts in deciphering ancient Egyptian texts, examined these same papyri, their translations painted a very different picture.
Right. They basically said, hold on a second. These aren't some lost writings of Abraham.
Exactly.
These are common funeral texts.
Right.
From centuries after Abraham would have even lived.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, how has the church addressed this glaring discrepancy?
That's what we're going to unpack today. The church's response to this controversy, think of it as almost like a historical detective story,
Right.
where we're tracing their stance across 3 distinct periods, starting in 1842 when the Book of Abraham was first published.
Okay, so let's set the stage.
Yeah.
It's the mid-1800s, and Egyptomania is sweeping the world.
Yeah.
The Rosetta Stone has been deciphered, and there's this explosion of interest in all things ancient Egypt.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's fascinated by mummies and pyramids and hieroglyphs.
And right in the middle of all this excitement, Joseph Smith comes forward with this incredible claim that he has translated the Book of Abraham from ancient papyri.
The timing couldn't have been more perfect, right?
No, not at all.
It completely captured the public's imagination.
Absolutely. And Smith even included these striking illustrations called facsimiles in the Book of Abraham, claiming they were directly linked to Abraham himself.
Wow, so he's really going all in on this, right?
Yeah, he's saying, this is the real deal.
Yeah.
This is not just some made-up story. This is directly connected to the patriarch Abraham.
Yeah.
But as Egyptology becomes a more rigorous field, scholars start to examine Smith's work.
Right.
And let's just say they're not buying it.
Yeah. They weren't impressed, were they?
No, not at all.
What was their response like?
Their response is actually quite harsh.
Really?
Some even accused Smith of impudent fraud and being utterly ignorant of Egyptian culture.
Wow, so they're not pulling any punches.
No.
Do we have any, specific examples of what they were saying?
Yeah. For example, Dr. James H. Breasted, a leading Egyptologist at the time, flat out stated that Smith's interpretations show he was totally unacquainted with the significance of these documents.
So they're basically saying that Smith just didn't know what he was talking about when it came to Egyptian stuff.
Exactly. And this wasn't just, some random person on the street. These were respected experts in the field.
Wow, so the church is facing some serious pushback here.
Yeah, folks whose opinions held real weight.
Right.
And they saw clear evidence that Smith's translations were simply wrong.
So how did the church respond to this mounting criticism?
Well, this is where we enter the second phase of their response, which we could call limited engagement and concealment.
Limited engagement and concealment.
Yeah, and it spans from the 1930s to 1968.
Okay.
And it's marked by a noticeable shift in strategy.
So instead of directly addressing the criticisms, they kind of went silent.
Not entirely silent, but they definitely chose to engage only selectively with the evidence. There's an interesting example from the 1930s involving a church member named Dr. Sidney Sperry.
What happened with him?
Sperry was allowed to examine some of Joseph Smith's Egyptian papers.
Okay.
Potentially very revealing stuff.
Yeah.
But the church placed strict restrictions on public access to these documents.
That seems a little suspicious.
Yeah.
Why restrict access unless there was something they didn't want the public to see?
It's a good question, right? And it gets even more intriguing in 1967 when a portion of the original papyri
Oh, wow.
used by Smith resurfaces in the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
So they actually found some of the original stuff.
Right. This was a huge discovery because it allowed Egyptologists to directly compare the actual text with Smith's translation.
You'd think the church would have jumped at the chance to clear up the controversy once and for all.
You would think so, but instead they asked Hugh Nibley,
Okay.
a prominent Mormon scholar, to examine the papyri
Okay.
and get this Nibley consulted with an amateur Egyptologist.
An amateur? Why not go to the top experts at this point?
Yeah, who confirmed, as expected, that the papyri were standard funerary documents.
It's a very curious choice.
It is.
And some sources suggest that Nibley himself feared involving academic experts because it would lead to further embarrassment for the church. That definitely raises some questions about their commitment to transparency, doesn't it?
It does. And if we connect this back to that restricted access to Smith's Egyptian papers,
Right.
a pattern starts to emerge.
Yeah.
During this period, the church seems to be more focused on protecting its image than engaging in open dialogue about the Book of Abraham.
So the response during this time wasn't exactly intellectually honest, was it?
Well, that's a question we'll keep exploring as we move into the third period of the church's response,
Okay.
which is shifting narrative and limited disclosure,
Mhm.
which starts in the late 1960s and continues to the present day.
All right, so we're moving into this third period of the church's response to the Book of Abraham criticism.
Uh-huh.
And this one starts in the late 1960s.
Right.
And continues all the way to the present day.
It does.
We're calling this period shifting narrative and limited disclosure.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fascinating because this is where the church really starts grappling with this growing body of evidence from Egyptology.
Okay.
They can't really just ignore it anymore.
Right.
So they begin to develop more elaborate explanations, trying to kind of reconcile the Book of Abraham with these findings.
So what kind of explanations are we talking about here? Did they like completely change their stance or?
No, not entirely.
Okay.
One of the key ideas they put forward is this thing called the catalyst theory.
Catalyst theory, what's that all about?
It essentially argues that the papyri weren't the literal source of the Book of Abraham,
Okay.
but rather acted as a catalyst to trigger divine revelation for Joseph Smith.
So they're saying that the papyri were more like a springboard for inspiration
Right.
rather than a direct translation source.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
It's an attempt to explain how Smith could have produced a text that, according to, Egyptologists, has no connection to the papyri that he claimed to be translating.
But even if we entertain that idea for a second,
Yeah.
doesn't it contradict what the Book of Abraham itself says?
Yeah.
I remember reading a passage where it like directly links the text to one of those illustrations,
Uh-huh.
like facsimile 1.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The Book of Abraham explicitly states that facsimile 1 depicts a scene from Abraham's life.
Right. So if the papyri were just this trigger for inspiration,
Yeah.
then why would the text of the Book of Abraham be so specific
Right.
about the content of that illustration?
Yeah, it creates a real problem for the catalyst theory.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty big inconsistency.
It is.
How have critics responded to this catalyst theory?
Well, they've pointed out this exact contradiction, arguing that the catalyst theory is kind of a convenient way for the church to try and explain away these discrepancies without actually addressing the core issue.
Which is that the papyri and the Book of Abraham simply don't match up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the criticism doesn't stop there.
Oh, okay.
Remember those comments from leading Egyptologists like Dr. James H. Breasted, who called Smith's interpretations totally unacquainted with the significance of these documents?
Yeah, those were pretty scathing.
They were.
Yeah.
And they highlight a key problem for the church's response.
Okay.
They haven't really engaged with those critiques in a meaningful way.
So instead, they've relied on explanations like this catalyst theory,
Right.
which some critics see as a way to kind of avoid admitting that Smith might have just been wrong.
Right.
So it sounds like this third period is characterized by attempts to reinterpret the evidence
Uh-huh.
without necessarily changing the fundamental claim
Right.
that the Book of Abraham is a divinely inspired text.
That's a good way to
Yeah.
put it. And this brings us to a crucial moment in 2014
Right.
when the church published an official essay on their website
Okay.
titled Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham.
This seems like a key piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Let's dive into that a bit.
Sure.
What does the church say in this essay about the Book of Abraham?
Well, they acknowledge that the papyri fragments we have don't directly correspond to the text of the Book of Abraham.
Okay.
However, they suggest that Joseph Smith may have worked from additional papyri that are now lost or destroyed.
Ah, so like the missing scroll theory.
The missing scrolls.
Yeah.
Right. Always a handy explanation.
Yeah, but even if we entertain that possibility, we still have the problem of Smith's interpretations of the facsimiles that we do have.
Yeah.
Right? And those are demonstrably wrong.
Right.
As those Egyptologists pointed out.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
The essay tries to address this issue by downplaying the significance of the facsimiles, claiming that Smith's interpretations weren't meant to be literal translations, but rather inspired interpretation.
Inspired interpretation.
Yeah.
So basically they're saying he wasn't bound by the actual images,
Right.
but that he was kind of drawing on divine inspiration to understand them.
That's the essence of it.
Okay.
The essay argues that the facsimiles were more like catalysts for Smith's revelations,
Okay.
not the direct source of the text.
But again, doesn't that create a contradiction?
Yeah.
Just like catalyst theory.
Mhm.
If the facsimiles were just catalysts for inspiration,
Right.
why would the text of the Book of Abraham specifically reference facsimile 1
Right.
as if it was a literal depiction of events?
That's a great question, and it's one that critics have raised as well.
Yeah.
It highlights the challenge the church faces in trying to reconcile the evidence with their belief in the divine origin of the Book of Abraham.
So aside from this inspired interpretation idea
Yeah.
and the hope of finding these lost papyri,
Uh-huh.
what else does this essay say?
Well, it tries to shift some of the blame away from Joseph Smith.
Okay.
It suggests that the scribes who helped him copy and prepare the text might have made errors leading to some of the discrepancies.
So they're saying that it could be the scribe's fault.
It's an attempt to create some distance between Smith and those incorrect interpretations.
Right.
But of course, the scribes were working under Smith's direction.
Right.
They were copying what he claimed were the correct translations.
So ultimately, it still comes back to Smith.
Right.
Yeah.
And the essay doesn't really address those broader criticisms from scholars who say that the Book of Abraham borrows heavily from other texts available to Smith at the time.
So has this 2014 essay persuaded the critics?
Not at all.
Okay.
In fact, many scholars see it as an attempt to kind of control the narrative, to offer these plausible-sounding explanations
Right.
without fully engaging with the weight of the evidence.
Yeah.
They argue that the essay raises more questions than it answers.
So even in the present day, the church is maintaining that the Book of Abraham is a genuine divinely inspired text.
AR.
But they're not really offering any concrete evidence to support that claim.
That's the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
And it leaves a lot of people, both within and outside the church, feeling frustrated and unsatisfied.
I can imagine.
Yeah, they're left with this ambiguity, this
Right.
lack of clear answers.
So after examining the church's response across these 3 periods, do you think they have been intellectually honest and open in their approach?
Well, that's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
I think the church hasn't fully acknowledged the depth of the problems with the Book of Abraham.
It seems like they're holding on to the hope that some future discovery, like those missing papyri,
Right.
might vindicate their claims.
They might.
But in the meantime, they've put forward these explanations like the catalyst theory and the idea of inspired interpretations.
Right.
But these haven't really satisfied those who view the evidence from Egyptology as pretty damning.
Right.
So it seems like the church is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Their belief in the divine origin of the Book of Abraham and this mountain of evidence that contradicts those claims.
It's a complex situation.
It is.
And it raises some profound questions about faith, authority, and the interpretation of religious texts.
And those are all questions I think worth wrestling with, regardless of your personal beliefs.
I agree.
Absolutely.
And this whole story, I think, invites us to think critically about how we form our beliefs, how we evaluate evidence, and how we respond when those deeply held convictions are challenged.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've traveled through over a century of history,
We have.
examined the church's evolving response to this really complex controversy.
Yeah.
We've uncovered some intriguing details, heard from leading experts,
We have.
and wrestled with some tough questions.
It's been a journey.
It has.
And I think that's the value of a deep dive like this. It's not about arriving at definitive answers,
Right.
but about engaging in thoughtful exploration,
Yeah.
considering different perspectives,
Uh-huh.
and perhaps coming away with more questions than we started with.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect segue into our final discussion.
Yeah.
We've focused on the church's response.
Uh-huh.
But what about the individual believer?
Right.
How does someone reconcile their faith with these challenges to a text that they consider sacred? Let's explore that next.
Okay, so we've spent most of this deep dive, kind of unpacking the Mormon Church's institutional response to this Book of Abraham controversy.
Mhm.
But now I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and think about the individual believer.
Right.
For millions of Mormons, the Book of Abraham isn't just some ancient text. It's
Yeah?
part of their core scripture.
Okay.
It's a source of spiritual guidance and connection to their faith.
Absolutely.
So how do devout Mormons reconcile those beliefs with these pretty stark contradictions that we've been discussing?
Like what are they thinking and feeling as they try to navigate this kind of complex landscape?
I think it's important to remember that faith is deeply personal.
Right.
There's no single monolithic Mormon response.
Right.
Some believers might find comfort in those official explanations we discussed, like the catalyst theory or the idea of inspire interpretation. They might trust that the church is doing its best to address the issue.
Right.
And that further research will eventually kind of resolve the discrepancies.
Yeah, that makes sense. For some, faith might provide a lens through which they interpret the evidence.
Right.
Even if it seems contradictory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Others might, choose to focus on the spiritual value they find in the Book of Abraham, and just kind of set aside the historical and linguistic challenges.
Right.
They might emphasize the personal meaning the text holds for them, regardless of its origins.
It's like saying, this book speaks to my soul, and that's what matters most.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a perfectly valid approach for some.
Right.
Faith often involves grappling with difficult questions
Ah.
and embracing uncertainty.
Right. It's not always about having all the answers.
Yeah.
But what about those who are less comfortable with ambiguity?
Right.
Or who find the evidence from Egyptology just too compelling to ignore?
Yeah.
What options do they have?
Well, for some, this might lead to a crisis of faith.
Right.
They might start to question the foundational claims of their religion,
Mhm.
wondering, if Joseph Smith was truly a prophet,
Right.
or if the Book of Abraham is really a reliable source of spiritual truth.
Yeah, that must be incredibly difficult and disorienting.
It can be.
Yeah.
Some might feel betrayed or disillusioned,
Right.
leading them to distance themselves from the church or even leave the faith altogether.
Wow.
And this is a deeply personal journey.
Yeah.
And there's no right or wrong way to navigate it.
It sounds like this Book of Abraham controversy can be a real catalyst for introspection and soul-searching for a lot of Mormons.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It forces them to confront these, fundamental questions about the nature of faith,
Right.
the authority of Scripture, and their own personal beliefs.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy process, but it can be a profound opportunity for growth and self-discovery.
And for those who choose to remain within the faith,
Yeah.
how do they kind of reconcile these challenges?
Well, some might find solace in the idea that religious texts can be interpreted in multiple ways.
Okay.
They might see the Book of Abraham as a product of its time, reflecting the cultural and intellectual influences of Joseph Smith's era.
Right.
They might acknowledge the historical problems, but still find spiritual value
Mm-hmm.
in the text message.
So it's like saying, the historical context is important, but it doesn't diminish the spiritual power of the text for me.
Right. And that's a perspective that allows them to maintain their faith while acknowledging the complexities and challenges
Right.
posed by the evidence.
So it seems like there's a wide spectrum of responses
There is.
among individual believers,
Yeah.
ranging from unwavering acceptance
Right.
to questioning and doubt, and even to like a complete reevaluation of their faith.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty and complexity of human belief.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. It's
No.
deeply personal,
Yeah.
shaped by individual experiences, values, and interpretations.
And I think that's an important takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
This Book of Abraham controversy isn't just an academic debate about ancient texts.
Right.
It has real-world implications for people's lives, their beliefs, and their sense of identity.
It does.
Yeah, it reminds us that faith isn't static.
Uh-huh.
It's a dynamic process,
Right.
often involving, wrestling with doubt, ambiguity, and challenging questions.
It does.
And it's okay. It's part of what makes faith so meaningful and powerful.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey.
It has.
We've explored the Mormon Church's institutional response to this Book of Abraham controversy,
We have.
traced their evolving stance across different periods,
Yeah.
and consider the diverse ways individual believers grapple with these challenges.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
and I think we've come to appreciate the nuance and complexity of this issue.
Yeah,
There are no easy answers, no simple solutions.
for sure.
It's about engaging in thoughtful dialogue, respecting different perspectives, and continuing to seek understanding,
Yeah,
even when it's difficult.
well said.
Yeah,
I hope this deep dive has encouraged our listeners to do just that,
I hope so too.
to continue exploring, questioning, and engaging in meaningful conversations about faith, history, and the search for truth.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, it's the journey that matters, the
Yeah.
process of seeking understanding that
Yeah.
really enriches our lives and expands our horizons.
Couldn't agree more so. To our listeners, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking those deeper insights, and never stop exploring the world with an open mind and a curious heart.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.